I'm really delighted to welcome you to the inaugural Leila Ingrams Memorial Webinar, co-hosted by Friends of Birzeit University and the Council for Arab-British Understanding. This webinar, which we hope will become an annual occasion, is held in commemoration of Leila Ingram's life, which sadly ended this week 6 years ago, and the principles and causes she stood for. Much like her mother Doreen before her, Leila exemplified a commitment through her writing and campaigning to further understanding within Britain of the just causes of freedom in Palestine and the wider Arab world. She was also dedicated through her charitable activities to mobilizing very practical support for Palestinians. She was all too aware of the range of barriers facing young Palestinians as a result of decades of dispossession and occupation at the hands of Israel, and before that, the British. It was therefore in a gesture of solidarity and hope that Leila established with Fobzu the Doreen Ingrams Scholarship Fund in 2004 to support young women with special educational needs at Birzeit University, later to be renamed the Doreen and Leila Ingrams Scholarship after her death. It is an honor for Fobzu to host and manage the scholarship on behalf of the Ingrams family for the past 17 years, which, thanks to the generosity of the Ingrams, continues to support young women to achieve a university education at Birzeit. Fobzu was founded in 1978 by UK and Palestinian academics dedicated to building solidarity with the fledgling Birzeit University entering the second decade of a military occupation with all the repressive measures that entailed. Today, we provide scholarships to students at Birzeit University and other institutions in Palestine, work to build links between UK and Palestinian higher education, and raise awareness about the challenges facing Palestinian students and academics today. Leila worked for and campaigned with Cowboy for many years, an institution of which Doreen herself had co-founded. It is therefore very fitting that tonight this webinar is co-hosted with our friends at Cowboy. Particular welcome to Chris and Joe from Cowboy who are here this evening. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to extend a special welcome to all the members of the Ingrams family who have joined us this evening. It's wonderful to have you here, and would like to invite Dr. Alex Ingrams to say a few words on behalf of the family before we begin.
Sabah al-khair, sabah al-noor, ahlan wa sahlan. Good evening, good morning, whatever time of the day it is for you, wherever you are. Welcome to this event. We're delighted to see so many people here. So, as Omar has mentioned, the Doreen and Leila Ingrams Scholarship Fund exists to support female students in Palestine, especially students with special education needs. It was established in 2004 in honor of Doreen Ingrams and then renamed, adding Leila's name in 2018. Doreen and Leila, mother and daughter, worked tirelessly to advance knowledge and understanding of Palestine, and they were actively engaged in organizing educational and humanitarian projects in the UK. Throughout their remarkable careers, they were both passionate about women's causes. They endeavored to foster stronger relationships with Palestinians and to support members of society who were most in need. Doreen and Leila had a deep love of learning and everything, really, science, art, religion, literature, and they wanted to make the opportunity for learning possible for people who might otherwise miss out. Today we're holding this webinar in memory of Leila, who died, as Omar mentioned, almost exactly 6 years ago in March 2015. For everyone around the world today, life has really been turned upside down by the pandemic. And for Palestinians, the pandemic has attenuated ongoing political and economic challenges. I feel fairly certain that had Leila still been alive today, she would have agitated from the position of her quiet lockdown at home to raise awareness about the hardest influences of COVID and sought ways to do more for her friends overseas. So thank you very much for joining us for this webinar today. After the event, if you're interested in finding out more or making a donation, we have a brand new webpage with information about the fund, which you can find in the invite for the webinar as well. We'll mention this again after the event. But for now, I'll say a final thanks to you all, and I'll hand the screen back to Omar, and enjoy the event.
Thanks so much, Alex. So it's now just over a year since universities in Palestine shut for the first time in response to the spread of COVID-19 in the West Bank and Gaza. The pandemic has had a devastating effect on Palestinian society, which was already facing the pressures of a prolonged economic crisis and a bleak political situation. In higher education, Palestinian universities have struggled on multiple fronts. The sudden move to distance education, increasing numbers of students unable to pay tuition fees, and a wider funding crisis, to name but a few. This evening, to discuss the topic of COVID-19 and higher education in Palestine, I'm really delighted to welcome three distinguished colleagues from Birzeit University. Our first speaker will be Dr. Weeam Hammoudeh, who is Assistant Professor at the Institute of Community and Public Health and Coordinator of the Mental Health Unit at Birzeit University. She has published widely on a range of topics related to the social, political, and structural determinants of health and well-being, particularly in conflict contexts. Her recent research has addressed the preparedness of the Palestinian health system for the COVID response and mental health in Palestine amid the pandemic. Sadly, Dr. Ramahi had to withdraw from the event due to unforeseen circumstances, but I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tagreed Abed, who is Director of the Palestine and Arabic Studies Program, PAS, at Birzeit University. Having lectured in English at the Department of Languages and Translation since 2006. She currently researches pedagogical practices in teacher training and has published on these subjects. Last but far from least, I'm really happy to introduce Mariam Eideh, who is a fourth-year student at Birzeit University. She's from Ramallah and she's majoring in English literature. Mariam is an avid student of drama and is an active member of the book club at Birzeit. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Weeam to speak to us first.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you to Fobzu and to everybody and to the Ingrams family. So I'm going to focus a bit more on the effects of the pandemic and maybe say a little bit about the effect on education specifically, but I think Dr. Tagreed and Mariam will also speak to that more fully. Okay, so I'm going to start, before getting into the pandemic, I'm just going to say a little bit about the well-being of Palestinian youth in general, and this is an area that we've done a bit of work on at the Institute of Community and Public Health. So what we know is Palestinian youth in general have, through different surveys and also different studies, have generally been shown to have lower levels of well-being compared to other youth in the region or globally. And we've done quite a bit of work to try to understand the main factors or like determinants of well-being among Palestinian youth, especially under occupation. And I mean, and I think it's, you know, it's not going to be a surprise to anybody, but one of the main determinants or obstacles, let's say, and for well-being among Palestinian youth is related to the occupation in the larger political context. And that really does shape their experiences in other dimensions of life. You know, at a very basic level, it affects people's living conditions, it affects people's right to movement, their ability to, you know, to move around freely, their ability to also have certain freedoms in their lives. And so it's really actually, you know, if we're thinking as the broader structure, it's really shaped people's experiences and then more specifically youth. And what we're seeing is that increasingly it's having negative impacts in terms of the economic conditions that a lot of people are growing up under, and also the conditions that youth are, especially transitioning into during important life transitions. So we have one of the highest unemployment rates, and it's higher among youth, and it's even higher among educated youth, particularly women. So even though there has been an increase, for example, in women's labor force participation, most of that increase has actually been in unemployment. So they're trying to participate in the labor force, but they're unable to do so. And this is very much tied to the broader political conditions. And then the general state of insecurity related to occupation has also had negative effects on well-being and different mental health indicators. And it's also really shaped, it's really had an effect on political freedoms, on social freedoms, especially for women, where sometimes even even for families trying to be more protective or to protect women from the broader exposures to violence and whatnot, have actually become a lot more restrictive in terms of women's movement. And I think this is also important to keep in mind because education becomes one of the avenues that women and especially girls can really excel in. And this is where we've really seen a shift, especially in university education. And if we look at Birzeit University, for example, almost 60% of our student body consists of female students. And increasingly women are actually showing that they're just as capable. They're really, they're outperforming their male peers in a lot of different fields, but at the same time, they're still facing obstacles when it comes to labor force participation, and also other issues around like equality, both in the social and political realm. And so I think this is an important backdrop because this was the situation before COVID hit and before the pandemic. And initially, when we had the first few cases in Palestine, which started in Bethlehem, everything closed down almost immediately. There was a state of emergency that was called. We went into lockdown. I remember it was our last day at the university was a Thursday. The next day, and this is I think March 5th or 4th, the next day the state of emergency was declared, and we didn't go back to the university on a regular basis since then. And overnight we also had, and we only had like 4 days to actually switch to online education, which is actually quite remarkable given, some of the challenges in infrastructure. And so there was an extended lockdown with more restrictive measures that lasted for the good part of the first 3 months. But during that period of time, in terms of cases, the situation was still pretty contained. But for different reasons, partly also because of, during that period of time, there was the lockdown. A lot of people had to stay at home. But at the same time, there weren't really adequate social protections being offered to the most vulnerable groups. So there were growing demands and to open things back up, especially because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. And so things opened up. By July and August, we actually had one of the larger peaks in terms of the cases, and that's partly because and that's due to different issues. So things opened up pretty abruptly, despite there being an initial plan to actually phase into opening after quarantine. But also there were other demands on people in terms of like actually making a living, and we've talked to quite a few people who talked about having to being put in that position where they have to choose between risking their health and also risking not being able to provide for their children and their families. And then there was also a push to go back to normalcy. And during that time, it's also important to keep in mind that despite the presence of the Palestinian Authority, it's an authority that has very limited sovereignty. And so this actually affected the response to the pandemic, especially in areas classified as B and C, where there was limited sovereignty. There was also, and at the same time, during that same period, there was the backdrop of the annexation, which also resulted in the severing of coordination, which further complicated the response. And what we've seen since then is kind of the situation where some restrictions have been reinstated. schools have been, at times they've gone in person since August. At other times things have closed down. So there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of uncertainty on that front. And then for a period of time, things started to stabilize a little bit. But then in the last few weeks, we've actually had another peak. And this is probably and it's being described as the most dangerous phase of the pandemic so far, which is the third phase. And what we've seen is a very quick rise in cases on a daily basis. And that's jumped about like 4-folds or 5-folds from what it was about a month or a month and a half ago. But then more importantly, what we're seeing is that most hospitals are actually at 100% capacity and some are beyond 100% capacity. So case fatality rates are also increasing. There are more people that need ventilators than there are ventilators, which is in sharp contrast to that initial period where health resources were not really used in the same way. And then the other key area right now, which is also gaining some traction, is the whole discussion around vaccinations, which is really being pushed as one of the few ways out of the pandemic on a global scale. And there is this whole question of global inequalities in terms of who actually has access to vaccinations. And this is one of the areas that right now is becoming actually more pronounced and really shows the kind of apartheid that we live under, where Israel is actually the leading country in terms of vaccinations per population, where more than 2/3 of the population has actually received the first dose, and more than half have received 2 doses of the vaccine. So they've become fully vaccinated, and they're starting to open, and they have now the lowest daily rates that they've actually had for months. At the same time, we're really struggling to get any vaccines, and there have been few shipments here and there that have not nearly been enough for the population. Right now, I think about 30,000 people have been vaccinated at least once, and and that's in comparison to about 3 million that would actually need to be vaccinated to have any real public health impact. So this is one of the areas that's really where we're really seeing the occupation and also apartheid actually having an impact. And it's one of the areas where advocates have been calling for Israel to take on that responsibility as the occupying power, although it argues that it's not actually responsible for health. So cumulatively right now, there have been 260,390 cases in total, with about 61,000 of those cases in Gaza, a little less than 61,000. Since a few weeks ago, we've actually different governorates or districts in the West Bank have gone into more strict lockdowns and restrictive measures. Some of those have been eased up in the last week. But the situation has really is unfortunately out of control at this point. And so this has really had, as Ahmed mentioned earlier, like the pandemic has had effects globally on people's lives in various ways. And here what we're seeing, it's both the pandemic and the occupation simultaneously coming together to really have an impact on people's lives. Some of those structural inequalities and some of the structural uncertainties and precarious conditions Palestinians have lived under have actually become a lot more have had greater impacts. There's in work that is ongoing, and we've been actually doing to try to understand some of those mental health impacts and the uncertainty around COVID-19. People talk about greater uncertainty about the future, financial concerns that have been really worrisome. There are whole sectors that have been devastated, especially the tourism sector, which for the last few years has actually been one of the main sectors where there's been growth. There's there's also a lack of increasing mistrust and dissatisfaction with the government response, and especially in their inability to provide needed care and social protections, and to deliver also services in a more transparent and responsive manner. And this has been especially difficult for young people. And we've also done some work where we're trying to understand how this has impacted university students. And what we're finding is, the pandemic hit at a really key phase in their lives, especially for the students that were transitioning from high school to university. And so they were looking forward to this experience, and especially, and we've talked to some students at Birzeit, and they've talked about how it's usually like a very vibrant student environment. And all of a sudden, everything kind of shut down. And it's been particularly difficult for first-year students because they've had to start their university education with online learning. And at the same time, they don't feel prepared for it. And sometimes, and there are structural issues in terms of like the infrastructure of communications. Some students also, a lot of them live in these in homes with other siblings. So this has really impacted their ability to actually focus. There are growing financial concerns because sometimes, parents might be out of work or not working as much. So some of them have also had to take on greater responsibilities and have worried about being able to pay their tuition and meet those needs. And the other main thing that a lot of people have really talked about is the growing social isolation, which has really been pivotal in the past to mediate some of those negative impacts. And so they're unable to sort of draw on that same kind of social support, and they're not really able to actually engage with their friends. And what we're also finding is that this has had a greater effect on women because their movement is generally more restricted, and the university was really one of those avenues where they can actually spend a lot of time and really, and they would really find themselves in the university setting, but they've been severed from that. And what I should mention is that since these measures, there have been very brief periods where some students have been allowed to be physically present at universities and mostly labs, but this has maybe been, and it's been on and off again. So that in itself has also been quite challenging for students. But at the same time, I think, and hopefully Mariam will also maybe talk about this, but we do hear about stories of people kind of coming together virtually and trying to help each other in these difficult times. And we're really at this point also trying to work on providing some sort of alternative. We're working on, and we're trying to see whether it's possible to help provide some kind of support to students, especially those just starting out. So I'm going to end here, and I'm sorry to really end on a grim note, but the situation has actually been quite challenging. But I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Dr. Tagreed, who I think will talk a bit more about the teaching side or that experience for educators.
Shall I start or what?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Weeam. Pass over to Dr. Tagreed.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much. Actually, I've not participated in the research paper, and the situation and the circumstances of Dr. Rifa, and she provided me with the PowerPoint presentation, but I made certain modifications. I don't think if you can allow me to share screen, please. Can I? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Weeam, for telling everything about Palestine and about the Palestinian situation and the suffering of the Palestinians in this difficult time. First of all, Dr. Rifa conducted the research paper on the society and sample on Birzeit University. She started talking about COVID. Let's start with the first one. The impact of COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic on the higher education in Palestine. First of all, I'd like to give you a brief idea about Birzeit University, since you have never been there. Actually, it was established as a small school for girls in Birzeit and the nearby villages. Nowadays, it has been developed and it offers many graduate degrees like bachelor's, master's, and PhD in sociology, social studies, and recently in mathematics. And also it offers many programs, different programs in all the faculties. The introduction here is talking about the effect and the impact of the COVID-19 on all the society. As you can, we all know that we suffer from the impact of COVID and the lockdown, including all sectors, all walks of life, including the education sector. As far as the Birzeit University is concerned, we went under lockdown as all the universities and educational institutions, and we had to continue and to switch to online learning, and we had to do our roles, including the teachers and students. We hold responsibilities. We continue teaching online, teaching learning process online, even though some of the students had no experience. Even many of the colleagues did not have any experience using the online and other technological equipment. One of the effects of the lockdown was the concept of social and physical distances that required us to stay at home, to be in contact with the students and our colleagues, and we tried to do our best in order to continue the teaching learning process. Okay. We're talking about the university lecturers as well as the students. And the students with disabilities, the most important thing that Dr. Rifa and other colleagues conducted the research on Birzeit University, and the sample was there. And according to the Palestinian disability law, people with disabilities must be provided with equal opportunities for enrollment in schools and universities, and with all necessary pedagogic, they are integrated in society as well as the other healthy people. And Birzeit University encourages those disabled students to join Birzeit University. Now, the Minister of Education and the Minister of Higher Education, both of them started establishing a certain environment to be appropriate and to encourage the disabled students to join schools, colleges, and universities. Started preparing certain accommodations, providing students with technological equipment like restrooms, special pavement, for example, fields, sports, mobility, everything that can facilitate the process of movement or other disabled students, or all disabled students, actually. We come here to the most universities in the West Bank and Gaza started preparing everything to be easy and to facilitate the process for all the students, and to change the attitude of the people about the disabled students. Now, concerning Birzeit University, the situation in Birzeit University is actually maybe different from others, I don't know, but actually there are 72 disabled students in Birzeit University during the academic year 2020-21, and they're providing every facility for them in order to adjust to the situation and to continue their education. Now, the university has established the Institute of Speech and Speech Therapy to include all the students, disabled students, and to encourage them to participate in different ways. For example, taking part in different events, activities, competitions, and they equip the maybe library equipped with computers, printers, and electronic devices. Birzeit University, this is a very important point actually here, because we're talking about a special committee to follow up the disabled students. It's led by or guided by our colleagues and our teacher, Dr. Azim Assaf. It started in 2016-2017. The committee consists of a variety of people from different faculties, architecture, pharmacy, Department of Instruction, curriculum instruction, languages, psychology, and so on, in order to cooperate together and to work as one hand to help all the people and all the disabled students. Yes, I said this here. Okay, I said this here also. Here are examples of the issues the committee is working on. They're trying to do certain developments in this sector or to help the disabled people here. First of all, there are two or three things. Number one, examining the infrastructure to be suitable for the disabled, whether we're talking about visual impairment or physical or hearing and so on. They're trying to prepare certain ways or certain roads to accommodate maybe certain rooms and places in order to gather together and trying to examine all the attitudes and to meet with all decision makers in order to take decisions and to improve the situation in Birzeit University in order to allow all students or disabled students to participate and to join all the activities as well as the other students. Recently, Dr. Rifa has mentioned in her research the problem and the impact of the COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic on the disabled students in Palestine. Actually, according to the United Nations here, that indicated that the switch and being unprepared to move from face-to-face to online is a very challenging, and that's why there are problems. Even we, the healthy people, are suffering from problems switching from face-to-face to online. So researchers in higher education universities and institutions started to study the impact and the effect of the coronavirus pandemic on the disabled students. So research during the COVID-19, actually Dr. Rifa and her colleagues and our colleagues conducted qualitative research. They conducted interviews with 8 students of different impairments. 6 of them suffered from visual impairment and 2 physically disabled. They conducted the interview with 8 people out of 43, and 6 of them. Actually, I read the conclusion and I talked to Dr. Rifa, and the result is amazing. The results are amazing. Sorry, because 6 of them they faced challenges, but 2 of them they had positive attitudes and points of view. Actually, we have 2 sides. Okay. So the interview questions, sorry, please here, I have to read the questions. So there are 3 questions. Due to your impairment, do you need special technical equipment or other support to participate in digital lectures? 6 out of the 8 students answered yes. And the second one, do you have the necessary skills to fully use the technical support or other kinds of support provided for digital learning? 5 answered positively. And the third question, was it possible for you to acquire or get support in developing these skills? 4 said yes out of 8. Okay, so we come to okay, the research results. Dr. Rifa gathered the students' answers to all the questions. They analyzed the questions and they divided them into themes. They were almost 6 themes, divided into 6 themes of the effect of or the impact of the pandemic on disabled students. Taking into consideration the social aspects, including isolation and loneliness, lack of personal conversation, lack of contacts, and keeping them in an online environment. Okay, so we're talking about isolation and loneliness due to using the computer and being at home all time. This was a great challenge for the disabled students because they felt isolated in the rooms and no one to help them, or there was no one to talk to. Even sometimes in the homes, they did not understand. Maybe the parents did not or were not able to help the students with certain problems or technical problems or online programs. We come to personal conversation. This is very important because at university, we usually have students who accompany the disabled students and guide them from one place to another. But during the online learning and depending on the academic or due to academic pandemic, there was no conversation partners, no one to help them, and this was a great impact and challenging for this type of students. Lack of motivation. Many students expressed demotivation because of online learning. Actually, most of the students, not only the disabled students, because they are lonely, they are alone. There's nobody to help them. There's nobody to talk to them. Only some of them were motivated to continue online learning because they wanted to continue their education, and they some of them found and expressed the motivation of the learning environment in general. What do you mean by learning environment here? Because face to face, you have your students, your colleagues, and interaction between colleagues, between peers, and between the teacher and the student. But here and online, you're alone in the room. There's no one to talk to, and the environmental issues here. We're talking about the lack of the internet and difficulty to work. Some people or some students were not able to use certain programs or online programs or software, and other environmental issues here. We're talking about disappearance of the interpreter and the cut off electricity in some areas, in some villages, maybe sometimes because of the weather conditions. These were all also challenging for the students. We talk about lack of the internet. Actually, I'd like to modify this term here. I say, for example, poor internet connection, maybe, and lack of internet or computer or accessible internet in villages or in some areas. Maybe some students were not able to buy the computers and to have access to internet, which deprived them from following synchronous and asynchronous lectures and writing, for example, forum and blog, participating in events, online events, and so on. Also, if they were given assignments because of the poor internet connection or electricity cut off, they were not able to deliver the assignments on time. This was a great challenge for the students, depending on Dr. Rifat's result. And working on some software, I have to read here because it's from the students. Few participants reported that they confront or face difficulties and problems to work on some software related to disability. This is very important because they did not have previous experience. We moved, we switched directly from face-to-face to online. So all of us faced problems and difficulties, including the disabled students. Also, sorry. Disappearance of the interpreter. This is very important. Usually at Birzeit University, we have volunteers. If a person, for example, has a visual impairment, somebody else or his friends guide him to the room, to the whole room, to the classroom. If they have a question, for example, if they have to read something, the volunteers read for them. If they have a test, the volunteers write the answers for them. Of course, they dictate them the answer. But with the absence of the interaction and face-to-face, no conversation partners, no interpreter, and even if there's no connection, also there is a disappearance of the interpreter online. This was a great challenge for all the disabled students. Interactivity. The disabled students in their interviews said that the online class, it was interactive only between the teacher and the student, okay? Because sometimes there was no interaction between peers. There were maybe no break rooms, no group work, no teamwork, as if in the face-to-face sessions, okay? But here the only interaction was responding to the question of the teacher. So one way, okay? So it was another challenge. And they said that teamwork was another challenge for the participants in the online learning environment. Another answer was stress. Stress because stress came from being alone, being in isolation, and being or sitting most of the time in front of the screen, working, which caused headache or other problems, including the stress. Okay. So as we all know, everything has advantages and disadvantages, positive points and negative points. So some positive attitudes towards online. Actually, as I have just mentioned, there were 6 people or 6 students who have negative points, and only two had positive points. So these were quotation from the students themselves. One said that it has positive impact on my study because I cannot move outside the apartment. It made my study easy and facilitate my study. I need less effort to spend on my study because of online learning. Online learning assisted me to learn new skills. Less moving to the campus reduced the transportation cost of my study. Actually, as I understood also, because the disabled students were not able to move from one place to another. So staying at home was something beneficial for them, was a good point for them. Number one, to have more time to concentrate on their studies instead of wasting time from transportation from one place to another. And also they have more time to do homework or to do research papers and so on, or their assignments or what is being asked from them. And the most important thing is here it's cheaper for them because they do not have to pay for transport. Now we come to the negative points. One of them said, because of it, I failed in my courses. Because of it refers to the being unable to use the online programs or software, or to follow up with the teacher online, or because of the electricity cut off, or because of the availability of internet or computer or laptops and so on. And working environment in one room apartment extremely difficult because there's no clear separation between study and leisure time. Actually, I feel with the students because when I ask my students to respond or to interact or to answer my questions, many of them say, Doctor, I cannot do so. I'm sorry because I'm sitting with my parents in one room. So there's no space for all students to be separated in different rooms. Also, another point here is, their families usually have big members or large number of family members. So I remember that once said that I have 14 siblings, so we're dividing here in one corner, here one corner, to use the internet and to speak online. So it's very noisy. So actually, I feel with them. One of them said also, I am losing motivation. So they got demotivated because also of the poor or sound interruption and weak internet connection. In general, Dr. Rifa said that all participants in the current study faced many difficulties, faced many challenges in online learning, but actually they're trying to do their best. She said it's a kind of recommendation that improving the infrastructure for students with disability and finding ways to make disability students or disabled actually students connected together could benefit them and would enhance their learning. If we go back to face, inshallah, hopefully, after the coronavirus pandemic has been got rid or conquered, I feel from my experience being a teacher and lecturer at Birzeit University, most of the students, even healthy students, prefer face-to-face because of the interaction, because they keep together, they discuss, they share, exchange ideas, opinions, and so on. They benefit from each other, especially in teamwork, inside the classroom, group work, interaction with peers and teachers. And I would like to thank you so much instead of Dr. Rifa. And thank you for giving me the chance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tagreed.
I hope it was good.
Thank you so much. And there'll be a chance to raise questions and discuss further your or Dr. Rifa's research and Dr. Weeam's as well after our final speaker, okay. Mariam Eideh.
Hello. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So at first, how I found the transition to teaching online. At first, I found it very difficult. I still remember the last day on campus. Everything happened suddenly. There were news regarding the existence of COVID-19 cases in Bethlehem. So the government announced the state of emergency for 30 days, and the shift to e-learning was not immediate. So we were left with uncertainty and anxiety. And when the university announced the shift to e-learning, I was pleased with the idea that there will still be a place to carry on what we started, even under a pandemic. However, most of the students and I were not introduced to e-learning before, which caused some problems. The instructors were not used to it either, but Birzeit started giving the instructors courses about e-learning, and things started getting better. And one of the problems I faced was that the learning platform of Birzeit was not very developed. In fact, it was only used for a limited number of courses before the pandemic, which resulted in its breakdown. Yet again, Birzeit has spent a lot of money on it, and it became better. Not to forget that we started using Zoom to compensate for the problems found on the university's platform. And one of the things that helped overcoming the difficulty of the situation at the very beginning was that many instructors were really understanding. They understood how critical the situation was, and so they did not put extra pressure on us, at least at the very beginning. And of course, there were a lot of challenges, but also advantages. As for the challenges, the isolation was one of the biggest challenges. Having been used to meeting up with friends and colleagues on a daily basis, being isolated out of sudden was troubling for mental health. And in addition, another issue that was faced by a big portion of students is the outage of power and internet connection. In Palestine, a lot of regions face troubles with the internet and with power, and which is a very serious issue because the learning system depends on it. Also, another problem faced by a lot of students is that the limited number of devices available in a household. And in Palestine, the average number of children per family is 5. Yet, due to the difficult economic situation, it is hard to find enough devices suitable for e-learning, especially when the family has more than one student in universities and schools. Now, Birzeit started a campaign to provide some devices for students in need, which was partially helpful. Also, regarding the economic situation, a lot of students had no other choice but to take the semester off because they did not have the fees needed for registration. And another issue is that the students did not take e-learning seriously. Now, I think it's taken more seriously right now, but at the beginning, it was not. The participation in classes is less than the usual, which does not help in providing an atmosphere similar to the one we had in campus, and the classes are much quieter. And of course, being at home with a lot of distractions and for too long does not help with staying focused and staying in mood for studying. Now, as for the advantages, One of the changes that I really appreciate and I hope will continue once the pandemic is over is Birzeit's shift to cultural events to Zoom. Birzeit holds a lot of events and lectures that are political, cultural, and social, and they are very interesting and informative. However, prior to the pandemic, these events were held on campus, and these events were not recorded, and the time in which the events took place was not always suitable. But with the shift to e-learning, these events started taking place online and they started getting recorded. So now one can have access to them, which is great because of how informative they are. And also another advantage that I found as a literature student was that the grading system and the examination system changed. Before e-learning, we were examined in a classroom with a very limited time. However, now we are required to do assignments and to conduct research papers that require a lot of external resources. This advanced our writing and researching skills, and we are required to deal with the text more profoundly. But of course, here lies another problem, because due to the closure of the campus, it is hard to have access to our university's library and its books. It is possible, but it's very hard, especially when the government announces a lockdown. So we don't get to find the right resources to use in our assignments. The online resources are helpful, of course, but sometimes we don't find the right ones that we need to use. And now, as for the effect it had on my learning, I think it made me more determined and more self-dependent. When the pandemic started, it was obvious that the learning process is going to be impacted. The instructors lost the control they had on students in classes. They don't know for sure whether one is having breakfast or one is paying attention to them. And this caused me to start self-regulating, and I paid extra effort to compensate for the change in the process of learning. I started studying harder, and I tried to provide a suitable learning environment for learning so that I will concentrate as I do in the classes held on campus. And to be honest, I really benefited from all the courses that I took last semester. I was afraid that the online classes will harm the quality of my education and my preservation, but it didn't. Of course, the quality is not the same as the quality of classes on campus, but still I say that the instructors did their best to ensure that we are benefiting from the courses. And I even scored the highest grade on the Faculty of Arts last semester. Now, as for how we as students responded to the challenges, as for the isolation problem, I tried to be as connected as possible with other students during the lockdown. Students in my university created a lot of groups on Facebook to compensate for the lack of social life. For example, there are groups for courses, for university problems, for memes, for mental health, for cinema, and more. So this was a great support because it allowed students to communicate and to create new friendships while being socially distanced. Another challenge was that the power and the internet outage would result in the students not being able to attend lectures, yet these lectures were not always recorded, which would result in the students missing their classes. Because of this, and because of other problems such as the breakdown of our learning platform and problems faced by students in the exams, the students declared a strike that lasted a couple of days until the university promised some changes. And after the strike, more instructors started recording the classes, and Birzeit developed our learning platform even more. And the instructors responded to our demands, and they started giving us more times on the exams. Now, as for the transition's impact on university experience and social life, that the transition severely affected social life. Students tried to be more active in social media to adapt to the change, but of course, the social media does not solve the problem, but it's still a better option than being completely cut off from the university's community. As for extracurricular activities, some survived these transitions, but other activities did not. For example, there is a book club in Birzeit University, and after the transition, the meetings took place on Zoom. It also benefited from the transition. On campus, the club used to hold more than one session per day, and it was restricted by the opening hours of the university. But now that the sessions are held online, time is no longer an issue, and more students are able to participate. But of course, other activities were harmed by the transition. For example, football and basketball clubs were shut due to the lockdown. And back on campus, one did not even need to be a member in these clubs to use their facilities. And I remember the last weeks on campus where my friends and I used to play basketball after the lectures were over. However, of course, due to the transition, we can no longer do that. Yet another activity that survived the transition and that the students found very helpful, especially in these times, is the tutoring program held by the English department. In this program, students volunteer and help other students with specific subjects. Before the transition, the meetings took place on campus, and now they take place on Zoom. I participated in the program last semester, and the students found it helpful. Sometimes the internet would break down, and so they missed the information. Nonetheless, this program gives the students another opportunity to ask and learn about points they missed in classes. And thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for that wonderful insight into student life during this time. And big congratulations on your academic success this semester.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's been a really wonderful range of experiences that we've heard being shared and insights into the different dimensions of COVID-19 and its impact on higher education in Palestine. I'm going to thank all the speakers, Dr. Weeam, Dr. Tagreed, and of course, Mariam. It's been really wonderful hearing from all of you, shed so much insight, so many layers we've covered this evening. And on behalf of everyone here, I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us. And I thank you so much for everyone for coming. And please do consider making a donation if you're able to. Thank you and good night.